All right, so this morning, we are going to start one of the most epic sets of books of the Old Testament. And that's saying something considering we've already covered plagues, parting of seas, invasions, conquering. But we are starting the book of Samuel, the first book of Samuel. There are two. And a lot of times when there's like two books of the Bible, like First and Second Samuel, that sometimes means, especially in the Old Testament, that once upon a time they were one really long book of the Bible and somebody split them up. But sometimes it doesn't have to mean that. Like in First and Second Corinthians, those are two separate letters to the Corinthians, right? All right, but Samuel, First and Second Samuel, tell kind of the same story. It's the story again. It's so much. It's so much. It's the story of how Israel came to be a kingdom. So, as you guys know, up until now, Israel has not been ruled by a king, right? Um, they were ruled by judges, but judges weren't really like rulers in the sense that a king is. A judge really only stepped up when something external came along, an external threat, like invaders, like the Midianites or the Philistines, or when the Israelites were straying so far from God that they needed a corrective course, that they needed someone to speak to them to be God's voice. So that would be a judge. Which is also a prophet. But as we're going to go see going forward, we're going to have kings and we're going to have prophets. But we're no longer going to have judges because judges were kind of both. So, Samuel, what do we have? We have a mad king. We have a small shepherd boy who seems unlikely to be anything great, but then he takes down an enemy twice his size and goes to lead an army against the Mad King. We have a friendship formed with the Mad King's son, in which both risk their lives. Then the rightful king ascends the throne, and the dynasty will reign forever. And then horrible things happen. And then we get Act Two, right, where the rightful king, has the consequences of his own actions. He gets really he thinks that it's all about him, and it's really about hubris and falling away from God and doing what's right. There's a lot of stories like this. And probably one of the most popular is something like King Arthur. It's very similar, right? Where you have an unlikely king who rises up, and then it's, his own hubris, his own past sins that come back in the end to pull him down. Those are very similar stories. But King David came first. The First and Second Samuel came way before King Arthur. But if you like those kinds of stories, if you like King Arthur, if you like Lord of the Rings, if you like that kind of stuff, if you want kings and knights, loyalties and oaths, romance and violence, heroes and villains, all told with the backdrop of the fate of an entire nation, this is the book for you. This is Samuel. But you might be like, well, why is it called Samuel then? You might know of King David, and you're like, well, you have two books that are ultimately telling David's story. Why is it called Samuel? It's a great question. And today we are starting with a guy named Samuel. But really we're starting with his mom, Hannah. So, we're talking about how there's going to be kings, but last we studied, we were in a time of judges. So there has to be a transition, right? A transition from judges to kings. How did we go from being a kind of loose conglomeration of tribes who were only bound together when they were doing something wrong or when someone invaded them, to a kingdom ruled by a king? So to know that, we have to back all the way up. We have to back up to Samuel and to his mother, Hannah. So if you would please open your Bibles to 1 Samuel 1 through 8. That's 1 Samuel 1 through 8. There was a certain man of Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jerome, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his town to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival used to provoke her severely to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. So often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. So as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? All right, so we're introduced to a lot of people here. But the most important is Hannah. Hannah is married to a man who also has another wife. This is common. We've seen this a lot in the Old Testament, right? And, when we talked about Rachel and Leah, we talked about how if there's one moral to these stories of multiple wives, it's don't do it. Don't have multiple wives. It never ends well for anybody. So Hannah is married to a man who has another wife. The other wife has many children, but Hannah does not. Despite this, the man favors Hannah. We've seen this before. We saw this with Jacob and Rachel and Leah, right? Jacob loved Rachel, but Leah was the one who gave him a bunch of kids. So that seems to be kind of a biblical theme. Like Jacob, this husband thinks his love for her should be enough, that as long as he loves her, she shouldn't want children. But I think this is a case of a man missing the point and not understanding his wife's pain. Having a child meant a lot to women back then. Nowadays, it still means a lot. Being a mother is still really important to a lot of women. But that's a very emotional desire. It means the start of a new family, the start of a new life. And for some women, it's all their dreams coming true. But back in the ancient times, it was more than that. It was more than starting a family. It was more than like getting to be a mom. In ancient times, producing an heir was really an ancient woman's only role. We've talked about this. She wasn't allowed to work. She wasn't allowed to do anything else. And to fail to do that was, in a lot of ways, to fail in her purpose in life. Now, personally, I am grateful we live in a world that has moved beyond this. Babies and children are great. You guys are kids. We love you. Everybody loves a baby. Babies are adorable. But women are capable and able to do so much more. And nowadays we're allowed to do more, like I'm a rocket scientist. I put satellites in space. That's super cool, right? Unfortunately, because of the patriarchy and the misogyny of the time period, they didn't really allow women to reach their full capabilities. It pinned on them this one purpose, this one job, reproduction. So if you failed in that one job, things weren't good for you. It also put them in a precarious position, as we saw with Ruth. If your husband dies, you have no heir. You have nothing. Remember, Ruth had no heir. She was a poor widow with no way to make her life better. She needed a son to claim her husband's inheritance, and she couldn't claim it legally as a woman. She had no way to make her life better without a man of some sort, a husband or a son. So while not being able to have kids today can be sad, it's not nearly as big a deal as it was back then. So every year Hannah goes to the tabernacle. She makes sacrifices with her husband and her family. Remember, what is a tabernacle? The tabernacle is the tent where people worshiped and where the Ark of the Covenant was kept and sacrifices were made. There's no temple yet. There's no building. Tabernacle is like a mobile temple, except, of course, at this point, they're not mobile anymore. They're not wandering in the desert. They are staying in Israel, in the Promised Land, but they still don't have a temple. The Bible sometimes refers to it as a lowercase temple of the Lord, as opposed to the temple with a capital T. That's because it's not the temple, which has not been built yet. So anytime in this section it uses lowercase temple, just imagine in your mind the tabernacle, which is a tent church. It's a tent temple. And as we've talked about before, the temple in the Old Testament is more than a church is today. It is, a synagogue is more equivalent to a church, and that it's a place where you go to worship. the temple, the tabernacle, was the place where God was said to dwell. So it was a very important place, and there were occasional reasons why you would have to go there, for Passover, for Yom Kippur, those sorts of things. So at the tabernacle, we're introduced to Eli and his two sons. They are the priests who basically run the tabernacle, and they're going to be important very shortly. And as we're going to see, every year Hannah goes to the tabernacle and she prays. So now we're going to read 1 Samuel 1, 9 through 11. But first, I'm going to let these dogs out before they go insane. Be good, puppies. All right. The hounds have been released into the wild. All right. 1 Samuel 1, 9 through 11. After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child. Then I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. All right. As a woman, I don't believe Hannah would have been allowed into the tabernacle proper. She might have been allowed into the tabernacle's courtyard, but maybe she could only come to the gates. I'm really not sure. But she gets as close as she can, where she's allowed to go as a woman and prays. She's very emotional. This is very close to her heart. And she prays to God, basically like, oh God, if you would just give me a son, I will dedicate him to you. Remember, this is similar to when we studied Samson. Being a Nazirite was basically being a layman priest. Only Levites could be priests. Eli and his family would be Levites. But Hannah and her family are Ephraimites. They're not Levites. But anyone, even a woman, could become a Nazirite and serve God in this way. So she's saying, oh God, if you just give me a son, I will dedicate him back to you. Eli, the high priest at the time, he sees her. It says he's sitting at the doorpost of the tabernacle, which once again makes me think that she's not in the tabernacle. She's probably outside. So let's see what Eli thinks of Hannah's prayer. 1 Samuel 1, 12 through 14. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, how long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine. Does Eli see Hannah praying and think, oh my, what a pious woman praying to God? No. Does he see her and think, oh my, this woman is very emotional right now and sad, and maybe I should comfort her? No. Eli's mind goes immediately to the worst case cynical situation. This woman must be drunk, he thinks to himself, as if there is no other reason a woman might want to come and pray. Now, it's possible that drunk people stumbling around happened a lot, but I think it says a lot about Eli that he went for the cynical, little faith in humanity solution first. We see, we as people do this a lot, right? We see someone looking sick and throw up into the bushes and think they must be drunk, instead of maybe they're honestly sick and need help. I actually had this happen to me. When I started college, I was in marching band, and it was band camp, and I was extremely dehydrated. And sometimes when you're extremely dehydrated, it makes you throw up. And I was walking across campus, and suddenly I felt like I just needed to throw up, and I threw up in a trash can. And some parents who were helping their kid moved in looked at me very judgmentally. Fun fact about me is I don't drink. I've never drank. I've never had a drink. The most I have had is at a friend's wedding where I thought the communion was grape juice and it was not. So a little thimble of wine, right? So I've never been drunk, but people immediately assumed I was drunk. So that's kind of what's happening here with Eli. We see someone acting strange, and we think, oh, they must be high, instead of maybe there's something wrong. We write people off as the worst examples of humanity, instead of just giving them the benefit of doubt we would give ourselves. Hannah's not drunk. She's emotional. She's praying silently, but she's not speaking aloud, but she's still moving her lips because that's probably helping him pray. So she's like, right? Like, I wouldn't think she was drunk, but she's very emotional. So 1 Samuel 1:15 through 18. 1 Samuel 1:15 through 18. But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of great anxiety and vexation all this time." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer. So Eli's words could have scared Hannah off. It could have made her feel ashamed that he thought she was drunk instead of just troubled. Sometimes we feel that way when we're wrongly accused of something. Even though we did nothing wrong, if somebody accuses us, we feel that we did something wrong even though we didn't. We feel guilty. And if Hannah had left, she would never have had a chance to talk to him and actually feel some relief in her soul. It's not our job to scare people away from the church, away from God. And Eli should have known people. Thankfully, Hannah does not go away ashamed. Instead, she corrects him and tells him how troubled she is. Eli then basically says he hopes God grants her request. This makes Hannah feel better, maybe because she thinks Eli's words might mean more to God than hers since he's the high priest. We know that's not the case, but this is a misconception people often have, that pastors and priests have God's ear more than the rest of us. So maybe that is why Hannah felt comforted. Or maybe it was just that she was done praying and felt as if she had given her problem to God. We don't know. But we can see what happens next. 1 Samuel 1:19 through 23. 1 Samuel 1:19 through 23. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. In due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, "I have asked him of the Lord." The man Elkanah and all his household went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, "As soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, and that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and remain there forever. I will offer him as a Nazirite for all time." And her husband Elkanah said to her, "Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word." So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with the 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. She brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, and the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, "O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who is standing here in the presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me the petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord as long as he lives. He is given to the Lord." She left him there for the Lord. Hannah has a son. She names him Samuel. The next year, when it's time to go back for the yearly sacrifices, Hannah doesn't go. She says she's waiting until she can offer him as a Nazirite before she takes him. Basically, she's waiting until he's old enough that he doesn't need to be breastfed anymore, which back then could be fairly old, like 3 or even 4. Then when he's old enough, she takes him to the tabernacle, and they make their sacrifice, and they go to Eli. She's basically like, "I was that woman all those years ago, praying, and look how God has answered my prayers. And now I give him back to God." The implication here is basically that she leaves him at the tabernacle to be raised by Eli. Goodness. Why? Samson didn't have to be raised at the tabernacle to be a Nazirite. But Hannah wanted to fully give her son back to God because she knew her son didn't belong to her. He belonged to God. So she gives him to God's house, the tabernacle, where he'll be raised by the priest so that he can fully serve God. This child was the only thing Hannah wanted in her entire life. It would be very easy for her to keep him, for her to say that being a Nazirite doesn't really require him to be fully God's. She can raise him and keep him home. But Hannah is a woman of great faith, and she knows that it was God that gave Samuel to her. So she doesn't take the easy route. Instead, she gives up her son. She gives him back to God, what God has given to her, which is probably the hardest thing any mother can do, is to give up a child and to give up a child to God. So this kind of stuff obviously doesn't happen as much now. Nobody's like leaving you at the foot of the church being like, you will be raised by the pastors, right? But there are other ways where it can be hard for our parents when they want you to follow God. But if you, in following God, do something that they might view as dangerous or unsafe, like let's say you became a missionary and went to some place that's unsafe for Christians or where it's just unsafe in general, they may not want you to do that, your parents, because they want you to be safe and cared for. So it can be very hard for parents to give their children fully to God. So what Hannah does here is very difficult and commendable, even though it seems weird to us now, right? Because nobody's given up their 3-year-old. But all right, 1 Samuel 2, 1 through 10. This is Hannah's prayer. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. There is no holy one like the Lord, no one beside you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. And the bows of the mighty are broken, and the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread. Those who were hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he also exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with the princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness, for not by might does one prevail. The Lord, his adversary, shall be shattered. The Most High will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed. So giving up this child is one of the hardest things a mother can do. Yet, as we can see in this prayer, Hannah does it with exultation for God. Hannah's prayer is not one of despair, even though it would be easy for her to do so. Instead, she praises God for his great strength and power. There are few people in the Bible with faith like Hannah. So many of us want to keep close to us the things God has given us. We think the thing, whether it's money or talent or whatever, is ours. We earned it. We produced it. We worked for it. We forget that it is God who gives and takes. But Hannah doesn't forget. She does what most of us can't. Now we're going to skip forward slightly. The section we're skipping, we're going to come back to next week, though, because it's important. But for now, we're going to skip ahead to 1 Samuel 2, 18 through 21. 1 Samuel 2, 18 through 21. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. His mother used to make for him a little robe and take it to him each year when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord repay you with children by this woman for the gift she has made to the Lord." And then they would return to their home. And the Lord took note of Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. So even though Hannah gave Samuel to the tabernacle, she doesn't forget him. She makes him a little robe every year. And she brings it up to the tabernacle to him. Now, when you think of making a robe, you're probably thinking of going to the store, buying a bolt of cloth, and then coming home to sew it into a robe. If, you're going to make one. Most days, you just go to the store and buy a robe. That doesn't seem too hard. But that's not what this would be. There really weren't stores where you could just buy a bolt of cloth. You generally had to weave your own cloth. So imagine it would be much more painstaking. Hannah weaving individual threads until they make a cloth. And then they can come together and make a robe. This was her labor of love. Her way to remember her son every year and to remind him when she came to the tabernacle for her yearly sacrifices that she still loved him. I don't want you to think that Hannah gave up her son because she didn't love him. That is not the case. As we see from this, Hannah greatly loved Samuel. That's what makes the sacrifice all the more poignant. It's not really a sacrifice to give up something you don't love. That's why your parents don't ground you from things like school or vegetables. That's why we tell you that for Lent, you can't give up homework, right? It's not a sacrifice when you give up something that you would rather give up anyway. Oh, for Lent, I gave up cleaning. Right. So when your parents ground you, right, they ground you from things you like. When you give up something for Lent, you're supposed to give up something you like. Give up something that means something, something that you feel pain at its loss. Hannah would feel the pain of Samuel's loss, her firstborn son, the son who fulfilled her life's purpose, but she knows he belongs to God. God sees Hannah's faithfulness and he rewards her. He gives her 3 more sons and 2 daughters. Hannah's story is generally revered and taught for 2 reasons. One is this idea of sacrifice and giving back to God what is his. We don't own anything in this world. We think we do, but we don't. It all belongs to God. If Hannah can give up her son, how much easier should it be for us to give up our tithes or to give up candy for Lent? But the other reason she's remembered is her prayer. Hannah didn't hide her emotions from God. Hannah didn't pretend with God that everything was fine. In the beginning, she was praying so hard and so fervent that the priest thought she was drunk. She was not hiding. Was her prayer angry or just sad? I don't know, but we know it was anxious and she was greatly troubled. God doesn't want us to hold back from him. He wants you to take your requests and emotions, and yes, even your anger, to him. So remember Hannah when you pray. Remember, you can take anything to God. You can take any emotion to him, and you can pray as calmly or emotionally as you like. God hears you, and he will answer, though perhaps not always the way we want. Not everyone who prays for a child gets one. Not everyone who prays for a Corvette gets one. Not everyone who prays for wealth gets it, right? God has his own plans, and he had his own plans for Samuel. And we're going to see that in the coming weeks. And so with that, we'll end here. And next week, we're going to talk about Samuel himself, who these books of the Bible are named after.